Welcome to the Hail to the King podcast. I'm Mark.
And I'm Magnus.
And today we are going to kind of go over Stephen King.
An introduction to King. If you have never read his stuff, if you've only seen some of his movies, if you've only read one or two things and don't realize that there's a connected universe that he has established with all of his books and stories.
Yep.
So just kind of an intro for beginners.
Beginners. So we'll probably go over like style, maybe a couple recommendations. I don't know.
We don't want to blow your brains out with information, the fire hose to the face, but
you can find that on Wikipedia.
Just a couple little things to scratch. So a couple itches to scratch. So anyways, I guess in preparation for the episode, we had talked about one of the biggest things was I guess this will actually have it'll get a little spoilery, but not too much. But he has Dark Tower connections throughout his entire career, kind of established really early on. It's hard to say if he knew exactly what he was doing from day one, whether or not one character that appears in a story will show up in a Dark Tower book later on. Whether or not that was intentional sometimes can be debated, like Father Callahan in Salem's Lot shows up in Dark Tower. But anyways, a lot of his books, I would say, take place in the same world at different points in time, on different...
maybe different realities of the same world.
Different realities, but let's imagine it as a tower. And the floor of the tower... might include certain worlds, certain timelines, stuff like that. And then let's say you go up another level of the tower, you might have some of those same characters that exist or same places, but might not have the same events that have happened from the first level, if that makes sense.
And just to clarify for anybody who hasn't seen or read anything, the Dark Tower is... think of it as like he's described it as his Jupiter, but even more so than that, not just the biggest thing that he has written, that he's done, but also it encompasses everything else he has written. Everything that he's written connects to this Dark Tower universe, and there's an actual series. It's a 8-book series that all of these that actually goes into detail of the Dark Tower, the quest for it, and what that is. And so all of his books, things like Salem's Lot, to a smaller extent, Pet Sematary, which we've done an episode on, so go check it out if you haven't listened to it. All of these books, in some way, big or small, connect to the Dark Tower universe.
Yeah, it's very rare that you can't find a Dark Tower connection in any of his short stories, novels, movies, TV shows, all that. There's always some element of Dark Tower-ness to them. So one of the things we're going to do going forward, episode to episode, is have a segment where we say, hey, here's some Dark Tower connections. And obviously there will be some spoilers throughout this entire podcast. We kind of figure, hey, here's some spoilers. Maybe they'll interest you enough to pick up the book and read it. You see, seeing a map of Hawaii doesn't make you want to go to Hawaii any less, right?
Yeah. Knowing what's going to happen right after sex doesn't mean you're not going to do it.
Spoiler alert, I know how it ends.
Exactly. But honestly, that is, I don't know, seeing the map to Hawaii and then my more vulgar example. It does say something about the writing that it still has so much power, even if you go into it knowing what's going to happen. It has so much power regardless. If you spoil it for yourself, you're still going to go in and love,
Yeah, a very
love the book, love the story.
Let's get pop culture-y on this and compare. The Dark Tower is Stephen King's Infinity War. It's the gauntlet. Everything just culminating into one all-encompassing important storyline. It all leads up to the Dark Tower, essentially. And Yeah, Stephen King was doing the shared universe. He wasn't the first to do it, obviously. There's been many before him. Lovecraft was one of his biggest inspirations for that sort of thing. Sci-fi fantasy. You know, he had a, what was it? Arkham was the name of the town that Miskatonic University. I don't know how much you're into H.P. Lovecraft, but
I have only read a couple of his, to be honest.
I've checked out a lot of his, you know, more popular stuff and some of his less popular, but not all of it. But anyways, he's one of his, you know, kind of influences, not inspiration. Influence, that's a good word. And he was doing that, and obviously people even before him. But the shared universe thing is now extremely popular, especially with the Marvel movies and you know, Harry Potter and Star Wars. You know, they're kind of branching out in a cinematic universe, that kind of shared universe.
Yeah, it's expanded, you know, than what it is. And so yeah, Stephen King does this with his stories. It's a major thing. It's really fun because it's awesome to look for those little Easter eggs here and there.
Yeah, and one thing that actually got me really juiced for the Dark Tower movie was the trailer. When the trailer dropped, you know, a year and a half ago, there was all sorts of little Easter eggs to, you know, Pennywise, The Shining. You know, there was like a picture in the trailer of the Shining Hotel on a desk. There was what else? Oh, I know that Cujo, like a Saint Bernard, shows up just walking down the street in one shot. There's a whole bunch of just little Stephen King fan Easter eggs throughout the trailer. Even most of the ones from the movie actually show up in the trailer. Yeah. But unfortunately, the movie failed to launch a franchise, you know, that didn't do well enough, and deservedly so. It was okay. I liked it as a standalone adventure.
I think we liked it for what it was and what it was trying to do, because we got to see the gunslinger on the big screen.
Fleshed out.
And as far as just the character, Idris Elba did fantastic.
Did amazing.
I mean, there was nothing wrong with his portrayal. I think it was just the writing and the length of the movie. They didn't give it enough time to really build up and explain some things.
Yeah, that movie took a lot of elements from all the books, kind of made a big milkshake out of it, you know, and kind of wrecked the story in some ways and kind of added to the story in some ways. It was a treat for fans who could handle that sort of thing, but it caused a lot of issues amongst the diehard fans who need a 100% faithful adaptation of the books, which I appreciate both, you know, the loose adaptations as well as the faithful ones. Yeah. And as a Stephen King fan, if as you know, constant listener, as you become a Stephen King fan, or as you think about how big of a fan you already are, if you're checking out movies that are made and you've read the book already, you'll notice that 95% of the time the book is better than the movie. You know, there's very few exceptions to that. Like, I'd say maybe Shawshank Redemption, Green Mile. Those ones,
I'd say they're on par.
They pretty much hit that on par, if not maybe better. But at the same time, as a Stephen King fan, if you hear a movie's coming out or a Netflix or something, you kind of roll your eyes and think, oh boy, here we go. It's like, is this going to be terrible or awesome? You know, it's usually terrible. But lately, in the last couple years, they've been ramping up the quality. Yeah. So that's cool. So Dark Tower, very important. We will talk about it a lot on this podcast.
So what would you say? Okay. So someone new, you know, maybe someone listening right now is just coming to Stephen King. They're a Stephen King virgin. How are you going to convince them, hey, you should read Stephen King? Maybe they don't like horror. Because I think that's a misconception.
Misconception that all of his stories are horror. Yeah. In fact, I mentioned one, Shawshank Redemption, Green Mile. I mentioned more than one. There's a story he did called The Body, which is Stand By Me, an old, like, late 80s or early 90s coming of age kind of movie. he does horror. He does. I mean, it is pretty much a
That's
Stephen
horror.
King's or Steven Spielberg style coming of age that happens to also have horror elements, very similar to Stranger Things. You know, yeah. If I was to recommend like a first book for someone who hasn't read anything, maybe they've seen some of the movies, whatever, but maybe they're not into horror. I would probably recommend Green Mile.
That's exactly what I was gonna say.
It's not too long, but it's long enough to do the trick. I think once you get reading that book, it really pulls you in and doesn't let go. So that one was really fun. Side note, that one was really fun. He released it in episodes, like over, I think it was over the course of like several months. He would release a book, release another book, release another book. So it was a serialized one, and now it's collected all together. But
that's a really good one. It's cool because it is not horror at all. It's almost his version of the Christ story, and Christ being crucified and everything, being crucified for something he didn't do. Anyways, don't want to go too much into that, but that's kind of shows you that
he's capable of
so much more than horror.
But if I'm going to recommend a book to somebody who is into horror, I will say read The Stand. Especially if they can handle a longer book, because The Stand is great. Like throughout, start to finish, it's got enough characters to kind of showcase his different styles. He's got funny characters. He's got insane, evil characters. He's got the everyman type characters. And it's a very relatable situation. Everyone's afraid of getting sick, And so that's another one of those good recommendations. Good one to start on. And that one has a lot of connections to the Dark Tower as well.
I would have said, honestly, and I'm not disagreeing with The Stand, but I would have said Salem's Lot.
Salem's Lot.
Classic, good vampire story. You wouldn't go wrong with that. Showcases, just like The Stand, showcases his abilities to really bring characters to life, which is one of the things I think he does best. He really does awesome characters. He makes you care about them. They're believable because they are not the cliche, good guy, bad guy characters. Not a lot of people do that anymore.
Sometimes his like unimportant side characters that'll get like their own chapter, sometimes they'll be really like cliche and really kind of like
almost
a country
stock characters.
Yeah, like a stock character. And you'll hear their thoughts, you hear them complaining about, their bum leg or something like that. And he does a good job of making you, with just one chapter of hearing the way they think and the way that they're dealing with whatever situation they're in, you can automatically, what type of a character they are. If they, grew up and went to college, or if they just bummed around their hometown and, worked at the sawmill or something. Really easy to imagine their past based on what you are given by him. So
yeah, a lot of it comes through dialogue.
Just kind of read between the lines. The character breaks through the dialogue and you get a sense of who they are. So yeah.
So that's his characters are great. I'd say, I don't know, his stories are just fantastic. A lot of different things. He has sci-fi, he has horror, he has crime.
Yeah.
Crime dramas, like some recently.
Mr. Mercedes.
The Mr. Mercedes, the Mercedes Killer trilogy.
Yeah, which so far is 2 seasons. I think the second season is getting ready to release. The first season was amazing. The guy who plays Mad-Eye Moody from Harry Potter,
is
Gleason.
Detective Hodges.
Something Gleason. Brendan Gleason, yeah. He plays the kind of this retired police officer. And the book is very noir style, like an old paperback that you would find in your grandpa's house. It's very fun to read. But one thing that I almost forgot about to mention, I don't know why I keep saying one thing I forgot. Anyways, every 7 or so years, Stephen King releases a collection of short stories. So he likes to write novels, and he also likes to write these short stories, which he releases through Wall Street Journal for some reason, New York Times, Playboy magazine, Twilight Zone magazine. Throughout the years, he's submitted it to all these different publications
and publications,
and he'll just release these, a story here, story there, story here, story there, and then he collects them all together every 7 or so years into one book. And a lot of those stories actually end up becoming the movies that we see. A lot of his full novels do get adapted into movies, but a lot of times it's just the little short stories, because those are the easiest to turn into a movie. You don't have to, it's not overwhelming amount of information you got to get into the movie. It's just a little bit.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Throughout those collections, that's where I think he really shines with his diversity of what he writes about. Some of them are scary, some of them are sci-fi, some of them are little romantic, one-off little stories. Last week we covered The Jaunt, which is just a fun little story about
little
teleportation.
Sci-fi story.
Sci-fi. It could have been written by Ray Bradbury or something, but yeah. Richard Bachman.
Yeah.
So Stephen King. At one point, he decided to write under a pseudonym. Right? Is that how? I'm not just sounding dumb.
You're not
pseudonym of Richard Bachman, and I don't know if it was 100% just to prove to himself that he could still sell. I'm gonna turn over to Mark here. He looks like
I'm raising my hand. No, so and I just listened to this. So there's a couple reasons. Is that any popular novelist? Stephen King has been called a hack writer by so many critics and everything, and to the point that it seems that he, if I understand it, he even wondered at this point are my stories, are my books, becoming bestsellers because people actually see merit in them, or because they have the Stephen King name. And so at that time that he started writing as Bachman, it was not really, it was kind of frowned on, and it wasn't a thing for a writer to write more than 1 or 2 novels a year. And Stephen King,
he's a madman.
He's a madman. He's a workaholic, and I say that in a loving way. He writes every single day 1,000 words. That includes his birthday, Christmas, 4th of July, Thanksgiving. He's writing 1,000 words every single day. And so at that time, it wasn't publishers just felt that one author who would release more than 1 or 2 books a year would just saturate the market with that author, and the value would go down. And so he started writing under Richard Bachman, and there's 4.
Oh, there's many.
There's several Bachman books.
I can think of at least 6.
Well, I think there was 4 before he got outed.
Oh, okay, before he got outed.
So there's The Long Walk, Rage, Thinner, and Running Man.
Running Man, yeah, and then The Regulators was.
And that was after
he had been outed. Yeah.
Yeah, and so he started writing under that just to see, and the books did very well, and I think it was an editor or a newspaper reporter, something like that, found him out. They started to look at the style of Bachman and Stephen King and found out they were one and the same. And so he got outed that way.
Going back and reading some of them, being a Stephen King fan, you're like, yeah, I could see this being very written by him. But my favorite of the early Bachman books is The Long Walk, by the way. That one's great. It's 100 kids 100 teenage boys who start walking, and if you slow down or stop, you get shot. So it's this televised event that happens every year in the United States. And yeah, I think it's 2 kids from every state.
So it's almost like the Hunger Games, except with walking.
It's pretty much Hunger Games. And the main kid is just walking. He's making friends with the other kids. You know, they're all talking about what they're going to do when they win. And it's all camaraderie and whatever. And then about halfway through, it starts getting really serious. Characters start dying, and the kids realize, oh man, this is really happening. You know, we got to keep walking or we're going to die. And it's a really, really good one. So, yeah, Bachman.
Seems like the Bachman novels are a little bit darker tone as a whole. And maybe that's because he didn't write that many of them, but darker as a whole.
Do you know the story of Rage?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Rage is, I think, one of the few Stephen King books that he put out of print. He took it, I don't know how much influence he had, but Stephen King, it was in the locker of a kid who did a mass shooting. I can't remember which shooting it was. I don't think it was Columbine. Maybe it was, but anyways, this book has been found in like the lockers, and the story is about a school shooting.
Yeah,
and it's a little different. It's not just blood and gore. It gets into some weird psychology points. You know, just kind of what is reality, what is life about. You know, what's the point of everything? It's good. But they've put it out of print. You can still find it in paperback around. One of the easiest ones is a collection called the Bachman Books, which is three of his early novels just in one big paperback. But yeah, that I think that's the only one that he's voluntarily taken, off shelves, that he doesn't really want it out there.
Yeah,
but
that makes sense.
But yeah, they can get pretty violent. Stephen King can get pretty violent in general, but the fact that it was kind of a school shooting, potentially inspiring these kids, but you know, we don't want to get too into what really can affect people's mental health and stuff like that. And you know, Stephen King stories, yeah, some of them are violent, some of them are scary, some of them are whatever, but they're not going to make you go out and kill somebody.
Yeah.
So anyways, but just to play it safe.
That's our 2 cents on that.
Yeah, just to play it safe, they took the story away and, you know, whatever.
Yeah, so he's done the Bachman books. For those of you who don't know, he's done, right now I think it's at 59 novels. And I believe it's over 200 short stories. And the way he does this, and I thought this was interesting, is... just because I only know this because I just got done reading on writing, and he writes these longer novels, so he'll come out with like The Stand or, you know, something that's obviously a novel, and then after he's written it, the first or second draft, he will put it down for like 6 weeks, and while he puts it down, he'll usually write something completely different, off in a different direction, and usually it's a short story because he has 6 weeks to work on it. And so in between all these novels, he's just pounding out short story after short story, and that's why there's so many collections of those.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, I'm just recently getting into short stories by Stephen King, so
yeah, we're gonna start off the podcast, you know, kind of going forward, maybe trying out some of these shorter ones that are maybe more well known, with a few peppered in of the lesser known, but definitely worth reading. That's why we read The Jaunt.
It's probably lesser known, but fantastic read.
Yeah, and you know, we want you guys to develop a love for his stories. And maybe we'll cut out some of the lesser known short stories altogether, or we might do like an episode where we cover like, you know, 5 or 10 of them that are maybe not the greatest, but if you're a completionist like I am, you know, you'll eventually want to get around to it. So
yep.
Yeah.
Oh
well.
So,
you go ahead.
No, I'm just trying to think if we're
So I know we've talked about some Bachman, we've talked about some Dark Tower, shared universe, movie adaptations. You know, whether generally they're bad, but there's some definite good ones, and I think they're getting a lot better.
He has for those out there who may be interested in this, really good style. He's very I don't want to say economical with his words, because he's not afraid to give you some pretty good descriptions out there.
He's not afraid to write stupid. Yeah. I know that's one thing. Like he'll write very simplistic and just to the point, you know, without a lot of really colorful, grandiose words to just pretty up the writing and make it, you know, more sophisticated. He'll write, you know, like a character talks, you know, like a person talks or a person thinks.
It's very digestible. It's almost conversational, if your conversation is ideal. And I think that's how any, you know, most writing is. But really good style for those of you who are looking for something like that. Very readable. You're not gonna. I mean, they're thick. A lot of his novels are very thick books, but I don't know. Great style. They capture a lot of them. Capture you right away.
Know what story people should start on? They should start on Pet Sematary. That's why we did it as episode 1, right?
That's true. That's
you know,
a good horror movie.
It's only a couple hundred pages.
It's not a long one.
I can't seem to. Hold on. I might as well just tell you guys about how many pages. It's about 370 pages long, so not too long, not too short. That's one of, if people are really into like scary stories, that's probably one of his scariest. I'd say alongside like It and again The Stand, just some really spooky stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I think that covers
Mm-hmm.
covers a lot of King, what he's about, just writing good stories.
And we'll get into, you know, again, we don't want to overwhelm anybody, so we're just kind of very briefly talking about some of this stuff that we're talking about today will come up again later on, but yeah, if anyone has any input as to like a request a story, request a book or something for us to talk about, you know, feel free to. We'll probably have some method of contact, whether it's comments or email or something like that, or if you know who we are, come up and say, hey, you guys should read this, you know. But we'll try to announce ahead of time, maybe like 1 or 2 books or stories. I think we talked about it, and next week we were thinking about was it The Mist?
Yeah.
So we're thinking about covering The Mist, which is
that's a better known one.
You know, maybe like 150 or so pages. I don't even remember.
It's not long.
I shouldn't mention how many pages because I don't know. But it's a shorter story, and it's got some fun movie adaptation and stuff to talk about as well. But yeah.
If you guys are wanting to learn a little bit more about Stephen King and just the way he writes, super good read. His book on writing, Memoir of the Craft. It's a very easy read, whether you're reading a physical copy. I usually listen to most of what he writes, audiobook, and that one is a really good one if you want to listen to it because he reads it himself.
Yeah.
And so, I don't know, it
adds a lot to
him
about
reading.
50-50 autobiographical and also a kind of a tutorial slash here's, if you want to become a writer, here's a couple ideas to start, you know. So he has a couple non-fictions that are about writing. On Writing is one. What is it? Dance Macabre?
Yep. Dance Macabre is one.
That's another one. That one almost focuses more on just the horror element. That one's a lot more just on writing stories.
There is, at the start of Salem's Lot, there's a short introduction by Stephen King, and obviously read the book because it's amazing, but the introduction kind of gives you a good feel for who he is and why his kind of method of writing. I really like it. It's short, but it's almost like a condensed version of On Writing.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's interesting
really
how
fun.
he turns writing into a habit instead of necessarily a like something that he must do or that's optional. Again, he turned it into something that he does every single day. He does it probably more often than he, I don't even know. I'll probably
but
this part a little bit. But
it is part of his life.
yes,
Writing is not, it's just as much a part of him as a limb, one of his limbs, and you'll get a really good sense for that when you read On Writing, Dance Macabre, or any of his books where he talks about his process. And it's a really good process for anybody who's really wanting to get into
very
writing.
inspiring.
Yeah, it's inspiring, and it has fantastic information, much better than a lot of creative writing classes that you may take in college or high school.
Yeah, I think I remember after reading the book On Writing, he has a little challenge in the book where he has a challenge for the reader to go out and do. I can't remember the exact specifics of it, but yeah, it gets you just really juiced to go pick up a laptop or pick up a pencil and paper or whatever, start writing yourself.
Yeah.
And very few things motivate me to do that sort of thing. So, yeah, I should give it a read again.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's the end of our episode. If you haven't listened to our other podcasts, we do have one podcast on Pet Cemetery. Again, a great book. One on The Jaunt, and one coming up for The Mist. All of those great stories. You're going to have a good time reading them.
Oh, real quick. I wanted to mention why we decided to call this the Hail to the King podcast.
Oh.
So I can't even remember if we ever talked about it. So we're both big Bruce Campbell fans as well as Stephen King fans. Famous line from Army of Darkness, Hail to the King, baby. We're like, oh, hail to the king, hail to Stephen King. We're like, that's a really cool...
It's kind of a riff on that.
A riff on that, as well as a little bit deeper connection. If it wasn't for Stephen King's endorsement of the very first Evil Dead movie, that was basically like a low-budget, almost a student film, his endorsement pretty much launched that into the success that it became, and that spawned several movies and several seasons of a TV show, video games, all that stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's why we called it Hail to the King, because we love Stephen King and thought it would be fun to include a little nod to Bruce Campbell as well. Anyways,
well, I guess that concludes our episode today.
Throughout all of our recordings, if you hear kids in the background, just know that we're both dads. Sometimes it'll be my kids, sometimes it'll be Mark's kids, sometimes it'll be both of them. So we'll maybe mention it. Sorry about that. My kids screaming.
Yeah.
But we're not gonna hide the fact that we're dads.
Yeah.
So
it's part of us.
and that brings us to the end of the podcast, which this is how we're going to end it.